there is too much atmosphere. There are too many people talking about the atmosphere, but they're talking about it from a perspective of fear. And they're doing that simply because fear sells. If you're going to talk about pollution of any kind and you're effective, then the powers that want to be will violate your privacy, and then they're probably going to make up propaganda about what you're saying, because it's about perception management. It's about mind control through the use of words. So in understanding slave speak, I went back and I read things that I had written and realized that I was regurgitating the same slave speak words that had been taught to me. And that led to me deleting over 300 articles I had written.
This is I didn't think you were going to go right off into this direction, but this is brilliant because, you know, this whole slave species meme thing is a huge topic that I'm getting into at the moment in my own research regarding Gnosticism. You know, this whole slave species meme goes back a long, long way.
They took an Airbus, I think it was an A380, and at 80% thrust on a runway, when they were checking, you know, how many nanoparticles are coming out of this jet engine, 100 quadrillion ultrafine particles per second, meaning that's,
per second.
Yeah, per second at 80% thrust, 100 with 15 zeros behind it. Right now, the most recent numbers, 40 million flights per year. The CIA was involved in weather warfare in Vietnam and against Castro's Cuba. Well, it turns out the CIA then funded the National Science Foundation studies on climate intervention. John Brennan, former head of CIA, standing in front of the Council on Foreign Relations. I really like this idea of stratospheric aerosol injection. I call them the Climate Intelligence Agency.
They had massive flooding in Spain, which is, of course, a natural phenomenon called Dana, which people don't want to believe, but it does happen in Spain on a regular basis. The extremity of it has changed a little bit. And that has to do with various factors. Sometimes they've removed infrastructural aspects which may have stopped the flooding from being as bad as it would have.
The dam removals plus
right.
plus the Honga Tonga eruption. Most people don't even consider that we're still being affected by all that water that was blasted into the stratosphere by the Honga Tonga eruption. There is no such thing as weather control. There is only weather modification. We do not have control over anything. Control is an illusion.
You mean they didn't steer Helene toward those lithium fields and?
No, that's hocus pocus mumbo jumbo from fear porn pushing, clickbait title, rich dudes who, profit off the pain of others. Nobody, and I mean this, everybody will make the argument, but Jim, the military, they are always like 30 years ahead of everything. Right. You don't know what they know. Bullshit on this one. All right. Like I'm calling 100% bullshit on the military knows way more about how to control the weather than anybody else.
This idea that there's this full spectrum power control by a group of nefarious black ops agencies over the weather to keep us completely in chaos, right? This is a very, very dangerous thought to have because it's like we just don't have that kind of full spectrum control. And I think that's a relief it should be a relief for a lot of people. That should be a big takeaway because, people are depressed about this stuff.
Rule number 13 was all your carefully laid arguments can be easily ignored. And that's really where we are in this world. There are people who will, no matter how much evidence you show them, will choose to just ignore it all.
Welcome to CyberHive, everyone. Back for another installment of groundbreaking interviews, and today I'm honored to have with me the infamous Jim Lee. Jim's a geoengineering expert who's devoted the last 7+ years of his life to understanding and reporting the truth about the lengthy history of weather modification. So we're going to take take the boogeyman, I would say, out of the chemtrail monster and try to make sense of this worldwide phenomenon. Jim helps people understand complex weather-related ideas by creating maps, timelines, articles, and lectures. And his blog and the central location for all of his research is called climateviewer.com. And Jim's represented people such as himself at the EPA's hearing on aviation pollution in August 2015. In December 2016, he was even invited to lecture at the notorious G. Edward Griffin's conference on global warming, an inconvenient lie. And his research has been referenced on many prominent websites, including Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, Canadian Geophysical Union, MIT, Harvard, and the United Nations. So he created it, Climate Viewer, to kind of map out polluted regions in the world, to gather facts and things that are, I guess, where people are the most affected and how those facts can be used to combat pollution and raise awareness of technology, to monitor it, to educate others. And he's got another site called weather-modification if I'm not mistaken, where you'll find sort of an interactive graphic of the world's most comprehensive weather control timeline. So as you see, we've got with us a very illustrious guest. So without further ado, welcome, Jim.
Thanks for having me, Frank.
I should add before we really dig into this, I think the reason that we got in touch in the first place is because I kind of set off a shitstorm on the last episode of The Naked Truth with John Nolan on the Inspired channel when I sort of just dropped the idea out there that chemtrails, the audacious idea, I should add,
How
that
dare
chemtrails
you?
aren't really like a pull the switch conspiracy, but something that's part of a much greater picture of what is happening all around the world regarding air pollution and military programs. And so, that garnered me like a whole, really like a thunderstorm of hate mails, psychic arrows, super nasty comments under that video, including people saying that I've turned over to the other side and, I've joined Darth Vader, so to speak.
Yep.
So I thought, hey, the one to blame for that is Jim, because I took that information from his website. So we promptly got in touch, and I went back over that website and I went back over some of the videos, and I'm happy to say that I'm proud that I said what I did because I like to push buttons, not just simply for the sake of pushing buttons, because I think people need to know the truth of this issue because this is a huge conspiracy. And one of my topics in the world is busting conspiracies, not for the sake of busting them, but for the sake of getting past them in terms of fear mongering and just this idea of putting us in a constant state of stress. And I think you're the perfect guy to talk to there, Jim. So fire away. What do you have to say?
I fully agree with that there is too much atmosphere. There are too many people talking about the atmosphere, but they're talking about it from a perspective of fear. And they're doing that simply because fear sells. Um, I love the term fear porn. Just as people can be addicted to pornography, people are addicted to fear. And if you can't recognize in yourself that you're addicted to fear, then you're not going to be able to be open minded to other ideas. So I can admit that I too was once addicted to atmosphere. Um, and it wasn't until, I really had a slap in the face moment. I believed a comet was going to kill us all. Okay. It's really that dumb. That a comet named Elenin was going to come between the Earth and the sun, and there was going to be a solar kill shot, and we were all going to die. Several other prominent YouTubers were in the same camp, and we were all, going, well, there's so much science there. And then when nothing happened afterwards, I did a post-mortem and I said, how can a guy who thinks he's smart get played so hard? And that's when I discovered something called the anatomy of slave speak. For anybody who wants to read it, it changed my life. It's at climateviewer.com/propaganda. I typically talk about the three P's: pollution, privacy, and propaganda. Why? Because they're intimately linked. If you're going to talk about pollution of any kind and you're effective, then the powers that want to be will violate your privacy, and then they're probably going to make up propaganda about what you're saying. because it's about perception management. It's about mind control through the use of words. So, in understanding slave speak, I went back and I read things that I had written and realized that I was regurgitating the same slave speak words that had been taught to me. And that led to me deleting over 300 articles I had written.
Wow.
And I said,
Well, I mean, let me jump in there because this is such a, I didn't think you were going to go right off into this direction, but this is brilliant because, this whole slave species meme thing is a huge topic that I'm getting into at the moment in my own research regarding Gnosticism. This whole slave species meme goes back a long, long way.
that's
And
right.
I think people really need to, be honest with themselves, especially researchers. And I'm in that same boat as you. Like I'm going back now and I'm looking at things that I automatically accepted, as just, well, that's a conspiracy. Oh, there they are again. There it is again, right? And you get into this reflex. It's just an unconscious reflex where you automatically fall into that pattern. And then I guess in that sense, if that's happening and you recognize it, you have fallen into that trap in a way of believing those things that aren't even really substantiated by anything. Anyway, just wanted to interject that.
Yeah, and now it's like I tend to fall more into the line of a skeptic first, because I got played before, and because I can recognize manipulating words. Um, Good example, the simplest form of slave speak: high level versus low level descriptors. High level descriptors are let's start with low. Low level descriptors are words like coffee cup. You know, how about katana? We know what these are. We know katana sharp. We can actually hold it in our hands. It is a physical object, and nobody's really going to argue what a katana is or a coffee cup. These are low level descriptors because I don't have to go frank. Let's debate what a coffee cup is. We both agree on it just by using the word. However, high level descriptors are things like good, evil, God, government, chemtrail, contrail. Ooh, now we're getting into the problem. The problem is that these words are highly argumentative. They're usually based on a person's perception of a thing. So once you start to recognize that if a person is using a lot of high level descriptors, and when you ask them, what do you mean by chemtrail? Then they start to stumble over their words or they try to go to arguments from authority. Then you know that you're dealing with a person who's not really in a rational state. But you can't have that kind of debate with the typical clickbait video makers out there. It's one sided. You're the passive viewer. They're making all the arguments as if they were facts. And to a person who is, let's say, a novice in this area, of course, it sounds real. And I don't, begrudge anybody who's fooled by these people saying these things, because if you're not into all of this topic real heavily and you don't understand the atmosphere, you don't understand what a ice supersaturated region is, a contrail forming region, how relative humidity versus dew point depression versus temperature on a radiosonde data can tell you exactly where a plane is going to make a persistent contrail, an aerodynamic contrail, which will turn into a cirrus cloud. If you don't understand these things, then you're not going to get it. And one of my favorite like trolling songs on the internet, it's on YouTube, is "No amount of evidence will ever persuade an idiot." If you guys have never seen it, go look up the video. It's absolutely hilarious. And of course, it's related to electromagnetic radiation. And, I showed them the scientific documents. I showed them, papers from doctors, and they still are like, bro, you're the crazy one. So you go back to the rules of the internet, which we, made on 4chan so many years ago. Rule number 13 was all your carefully laid arguments can be easily ignored. And that's really where we are in this world. There's There are people who will, no matter how much evidence you show them, will choose to just ignore it all. Why? Because they've believed a thing so long that they're trapped in the Carl Sagan quote. And basically, it goes like this: once you've been bamboozled long enough, it is simply too painful to admit to yourself that you were wrong. Now, as I grow older, I grow wiser, and I realize that I do not have it all figured out. I've got a lot of it figured out, and I've been doing this. I know you said 7 years. I don't know where you read that, but closer to 20 years now, actually.
Right, right. Actually,
Um,
that was off your website, and I was wondering, that doesn't
I
sound
need to
right, but I
update my
didn't want to go
website.
overboard, right? But yes,
Yeah.
you've been at this a long time, and that's it's clearly evident from the data sets available on your website. People that go there, I mean, it's just such a like an encyclopedia of information. And I think that I often wondered, like, how do you get your hands on some of that information? Do you feel like, do you have to like worry that maybe, or look over your shoulder that maybe you're broaching into territory that you're revealing things that are kind of secret or that certain people don't really want out there? If that ever happened to you?
Yeah, when I mapped out the Five Eyes surveillance network, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, US, UK, and I mapped out all their spy facilities and the undersea cables that connect all the internet. I was actually interviewed, approached by some Val Kilmer looking dude in aviators at the poolside on my beach vacation while I was in the kiddie pool with my daughter. And we ended up having a 3 hour, let's just call it interview, over that. And since then, I testified at the EPA in 2015, and literally within a month of me testifying, I was shadow banned from the entire internet. You can literally go to Google and type in weather-modification-history.com, and that's a URL. It will not even show up. If you're lucky, it might show up on like the 50th to 100th response, Google
Right,
result.
right.
So
Crazy.
yeah, it's absolutely insane how much they say first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win.
Right,
I don't know where on that spectrum I am right now. They're certainly not fighting me. Nobody's coming around here. I've been a martial artist and a hacker since I was 12 years old. So nobody's coming around here, and I'm a marksman. I'm loaded to the gills with bullets to throw at people. So my phone number and my address are on my website. Nobody's ever dared show up. But at the same time, as far as like online suppression of reach, it's always been a battle, and I know it always will be. So everything I've done's pretty much been organic traffic. People who have basically heard the narrative for so long, and then they keep hearing the same thing till they realize they're not hearing anything new. And then
right,
once they develop a hunger for something new, something that explains it more, because their gut's already telling them, look, I've heard this for years. I've seen no change whatsoever. And the people who are saying it aren't offering any solutions. There must be something else out there. And I constantly get emails, your website's a breath of fresh air. I've been literally terrified of clouds. Um, and now I can actually go outside and go, yeah, that's messed up. I don't like what I'm seeing, but at least I understand what the hell's going on. And for
right.
me, that's payment enough, that I'm helping to be a voice of reason. And then alternatively, there are still those who will say, well, you're saying this is all just contrails. No, I'm not. You're saying that there are no secret programs. No, I'm not. What about cloud seeding, bro? I've talked about that for 20 years. What about HARP? I knew the director of HARP. We talked on the cell phone for 3 years straight. I've got a PowerPoint presentation on everything HARP can do. Controlling the weather is not one of them. Um, no amount of
Wow.
evidence can ever persuade an idiot. So people they get to meet you in little clips. You know what I mean? Little
Yeah,
nuggets. They don't get to see everything you've ever done. And I would never expect that somebody does watch everything I ever did. You need to spend a good 4 years worth of,
right.
waking up and, clockwork orange, peeling your eyes open to go through the stuff that I've made, let alone hear all the things I've said on other people's podcasts. So,
Well,
um,
you've made it easy with the graphical depictions that you create with animations and things and 3D even. That's a huge plus because many people aren't really, prepared to do a lot of reading, don't have the time to do a lot of watching. But like anything else, like I mean, with myself, if I stumble on something or some researcher and I'm intrigued, I do the deep dive into their stuff. I do make the investment in the time because it's necessary because we're all in this together, and I get that from your website is you really want us to, you really want to help, you care about the planet. I mean, geez, and you really want to help it move along. And I never actually heard of you before. It's funny, the I came across you because a mutual friend of mine and of my partner Tanya Maidenford and I, she wrote me and say, hey, check this
yeah.
out. And I just, I don't really have a lot of time as it is, and unfortunately, but I did happen to click on this video, and it was a short enough video for me to go, what, whoa, what's this all about? And then I realized that, I've been there's one other really famous geoengineering kind of reporter or whatever you want to call him that I was subscribing to that most people know because most people know him. I think his name is Dane Wigington, right? And I had subscribed to his emails and I get them all the time. And I think, what you just said is something that I tended to notice in the emails I was getting is there was this constant fear, messaging that, oh my God, it's coming again. The war is going to start and this and that. And I'm like, and at first I was like, wow, this guy's a hero, man. He's like putting himself out there. And meantime, like 3 years have gone by. I'm still subscribed and I still get the mails. And I started looking at the mails and it was like,
He's
there's
exactly the person I was talking about when I referred to
and
hearing the same thing for
hey,
years.
look, all the power to him. He's helped a lot of people break through into looking at that subject. So I never like to put anyone down for that has done any work that has put themselves out there. But I have to say, it's like I was just saying that subject of you need to sort of look past your own limitations and go, wait a minute, like after all this time, okay, where's the fruit? And that's
Right.
one of my favorite sayings, by their fruit you shall know them, right? All these people that are out there making all these claims, and I've been sort of interested in fringe topics myself since the last 30 plus years. So I've been around the block a long enough time to kind of see a lot of this stuff come up and go and be there. And now this whole new crop of people, these young people are coming up and they're grabbing those theories that I was into 30 years ago. I'm going, dude, man, we're so beyond that, but they're stuck in it. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, this kind of a research attitude actually stifles what is going on. So you wanted to jump in, please.
Yeah. So a lot of people get it twisted. They think that I just, completely hate Dane Wigington, which to a large extent is true. Like we personally have problems. I mean, I debated him in 2014. He threatened to sue the guy that recorded it, that if he ever released it online, that, he would sue him out of his house. Um, I won't go into the personal details, but personally, can't stand the guy. And he's a scumbag. I have no problems about this. Everybody knows this. Like, you ask me, I'm gonna tell you exactly how I feel. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. I'm a Scorpio, born in the year of the dragon. I'm a fighter by nature. I just don't care what your opinion of me is. I just care about the facts. And when you have a guy who claims to be the leader of a movement suing every other YouTuber out there that so much as broaches the topic, mentions his name, or anything like that, I see a bully. And I personally hate bullies. It's been a problem of mine since I was a child. However, I do not discount Dane's role in bringing this to a lot of people's attention. So, I appreciate the fact that Dane has made this a worldwide topic for people to look up and pay attention. However, I take offense to the blatant misinformation that he puts out, such as high bypass turbofans, big engines on commercial planes are incapable of creating contrails, when in fact the exact opposite is true. So telling people that contrails don't exist, that global warming is real, that even the global warming, cult is lying, and that we're actually at 5 degrees Celsius worth of heating, the entire biosphere is dying, that methane is going
Right.
to kill us all.
Right.
Um, all
This is
all of
destructive. Yeah.
these are empirically easily provable falsities. So when I hear this kind of stuff, it's like, okay, well, you're doing a lot of good, bringing a lot of people into the fold, but then you're squashing all that with your rhetoric that is not science based.
Right.
Um, and that's where a lot of people get stuck, because then you have neutered activists. You effectively have
Yes.
neutered the activists, because now they can't go to their local politician or whoever
Right.
and have an honest conversation with them, because immediately the scientist or the politician is going to go, well, this whole chemtrail thing has been easily debunked. What are you talking about? It's harmless water vapor. That's a lie too. Um, so on both camps, whether it be
Yeah.
the people who push the chemtrail narrative that it's all secret government, program, contrails don't exist, and it's all just poison that's intentionally sprayed. I hate the word sprayed. Um, and then on the other side, you have the debunkers who are saying it's just harmless water vapor. And to them, I say, well, you say condensation trail, condensing on what? And they don't, they immediately freeze up, clam up. They're like, oh no, it's just freezing. I'm like, that's called homogeneous nucleation, meaning all same thing. What in fact is happening is heterogeneous nucleation, meaning you have water vapor plus soot covered in graphene filled with metals. That's what the water condenses on. So we have to start with some basics. What creates a cloud? Water vapor, a cloud seed, also known as a cloud condensation nuclei or ice nucleating particle, CCN or INP, and galactic cosmic radiation, some kind of ionizing radiation, some form of static electricity that causes the first two to stick together. That's what creates clouds. You need the static to make the water condense on a substance, an aerosol, and that's what makes clouds. So, you know, if people don't understand just the basics of how clouds are formed and why they're formed, they're going to be completely screwed on trying to understand the rest. Because then they're scratching their head and they're going, but Jim, I saw two planes in the same area. One was making a short contrail, the other was making a huge chemtrail. Okay, bro. Did you look at the flight tracker? Did you understand you do understand that if two planes are flying in proximity to each other, they have to be at least 5,000 feet apart. So if you see them flying, pretty close together like
Right.
this,
Oh yeah, we see
then
that a lot. We see that a
then
lot. Yeah.
clearly one is almost a mile higher than the other. And that mile makes all the difference, because in the sky there are bodies of water. And where that water is called an ISSR, an ice supersaturated region. So to put this into perspective, in my Telegram chat, there's a former Navy meteorologist named Jeff. And his job on aircraft carriers was to prepare a flight plan for the pilots and tell them where contrail forming regions were. And you could do this through reading radio sonde data. What is a radio sonde? It's basically where they throw a balloon up in the air with a sensor on it, and it checks the temperature, the relative humidity, the dew point depression, all this, all the way up, going from 850 millibars at ground level up to 200 millibars, 100 millibars. We're talking 50, 60,000 feet in some cases. And as it goes up, it charts what the temperature is versus the dew point depression. Where they come within about 5 degrees of each other, that's where you're going to see contrails form. Whether they turn into persistent contrails or cirrus clouds, again, this is where I really like butt heads with everybody. whether you call it a chemtrail or a contrail, once it persists and turns into a white blanket in the sky, it is neither a chemtrail nor a contrail. It is now a cirrus cloud. Cirrus. That's an ice cloud. When Dan DeCicco, always butcher his name, is like Ziczo or something like that. Um, when he flew up through the chemtrail clouds and sniffed the cloud seeds that were in them, he found that they were 75% man made metals. So, in effect, we can say that these cirrus clouds, which are made by planes, are metal laden clouds. So, the cloud seeds in them are man made metals. Where did they come from? Well, it turns out when you test jet fuel, when you test jet exhaust, even on a runway with single particle mass spectrometry, we find that all of the metals that anybody has ever attributed with chemtrails are in jet fuel and the exhaust of a jet engine. It's not just the jet fuel. This is another thing that, over the last 5 years, as I learned more, I realized that I didn't have the full picture. Turns out also that engine grease, the lubrication that's put into jet engines for the turbines, they're typically made of barium
Right.
and lithium. These are greases. Okay, if anybody's a mechanic, bro, you've heard of lithium grease, right? So you know that this is a thing. Um, well, the same is true with aircraft. So some of that gets into the exhaust plume as well. And then the fans themselves, the big turbo fans that are in these high bypass engines, yes, it is true that 80% of the thrust comes from these fans, but the 20% thrust, all of it was generated by a jet engine. The jet is actually turning the fan, and the higher you get in elevation, the more radiation you
Right.
encounter. This radiation, something known as the Wigner effect, actually breaks down the metals in the fans. So you constantly have to do inspections on these engines to find out if there's wear and tear on the fans, on the different individual parts of the jet engine itself. So some of the aluminum and other metals that we're seeing in the exhaust is actually from erosion of the metals in the engines themselves. So it's a combination of these three, predominantly the jet fuel being burned, because if we're talking 1500 degrees roughly, most of these metals will survive that. These impurities in the jet fuel, and the impurities don't just come from the jet fuel per se. Whenever it's transported in trucks and then it's put into the airplane, the airport's fuel system lines and all of that, it's picking up metal impurities all along the way. So all of this leads to an absolutely absurd amount of nanoparticles, which are created when you burn jet fuel. In fact, read a couple studies on this, and they took an Airbus, I think it was an A380, and at 80% thrust on a runway, when they were checking, how many nanoparticles are coming out of this jet engine, 100 quadrillion ultrafine particles per second, meaning
Per
that's,
second.
yeah, per second at 80% thrust. So you start to think about it and you go, well, there's roughly anywhere between 120 to 150,000 flights per day. Right now, the most recent numbers, 40 million flights per year. Figure in the average flight time, some of these being, 8 hours, 10, 16 hours, 100 with 15 zeros behind it. That's how big that number is of nanoparticles per second. I'm actually going to have a little fun math game in the near future, because I'm going to create a fourth website devoted specifically to this topic, to not only teach people about the entire history of the chemtrail contrail problem, but to also give you the tools to be able to go and look at radio sound data, to be able to tell, to track the flights, be able to tell is the plane in an area that should be creating contrails or not.
So the
Because
flight
that's
trackers, they give us altitude, they give us the coordinates, the latitude, longitude coordinates, and those three are all you need to basically make that determination with respect to the data that's been deposited from that balloon you were describing earlier that's measuring
right.
the potential for the air and the whatever that it's like really I could the way I picture it is like layers of a swimming pool with denser and denser kind of
That's right. That's exactly
and
right.
right? Because the air is water, really. It's just we
The
don't,
sky is a river. It's the best way to describe it. The sky is a river. It is constantly changing. It has different temperatures. It has different thicknesses. All the way from the ground to the top of the troposphere, that's called the tropopause. And above that is the stratosphere. So when you look at these charts, you're going to see the temperatures over here, the dew point depressions over here. And then as you go up in altitude, they get closer and closer together. Here's where the contrails form. And then suddenly they will deviate quickly. That's called an inversion. The inversion occurs at the tropopause where the stratosphere starts. So suddenly the temperature is getting colder and colder. The dew point depression, which is basically temperature minus relative humidity equals dew point depression.
right,
Anyway, so like as they divert, that diversion is called an inversion because now suddenly it's getting warmer and it's getting drier. So very quickly, as you enter the stratosphere, no plane is going to create a contrail because the minute they fly above that, to give you an example, at the equator, the tropopause is typically around 42,000 feet. I live in South Carolina. It's typically around 39,000 feet. If you talk about the Canadian border of the United States, we're talking roughly 38 to 37,000 feet, sometimes 36. Closer you get to the North Pole, the lower it's going to go. So we're talking 32,000 feet. Odd point. Jeff calls me up one day and he says, dude, you got to see this. You're never going to believe this. And we're looking at the radio sound data out of California in the United States. Now, I just said 38,000 feet ish should be where the stratosphere begins. However, on this day, the tropopause was at 25,000 feet,
wow.
meaning that the stratosphere had pushed all the
Uh,
way down to 25,000 feet and that any plane flying through that area would not create a contrail at all. Here's the problem with that. The chemicals coming out of planes, they're unique because they have what's called a residence time. A lot of people say this. They go, well, how come when I breathe and it's cold outside, I see moisture, but it just evaporates? And I'm like, well, there was no cloud condensation nuclei, and the temperature wasn't right and enough humidity to sustain a cloud. Bro, do you science? And the same thing with cars. They're like, well, I see the car exhaust. It leaves like a little bit of a smoke plume, but it doesn't make clouds. And I said, again, you don't understand the
right,
Appleman-Schmidt criterion. The Schmidt-Appleman criterion is what determines whether clouds will form. So when you look at this as a whole, you go, well, the residence time in the troposphere typically is about anywhere from 2 days to 2 weeks, maybe 4 weeks. So the chemicals that come out of a jet engine, they typically will rain down and reach the ground within anywhere from 2 days to 2 weeks for the max because the troposphere is very turbulent. We have a lot of turnover. That's why you experience the bumpy ride in the airplane, turbulence.
right,
The turbulence is caused by all the mixing up and down the column of air. But once you reach the stratosphere, there's zero turbulence.
right,
And
exactly. Makes
that's
total
why
sense, though.
that's why when you look at a flight tracker, specifically the one I like the most, globe.adsbexchange.com, They have a color code there for what altitude the planes are flying at. Every single private plane on the planet is flying in the stratosphere. Why? Because they want to be able to sip their champagne and martinis and not have a bumpy ride.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was just on a flight, last month or this month, and the pilot said, "Well, we're having turbulence. We're going to go to another level, a higher altitude to smooth things out a little bit." I mean,
Hmm.
it's like you said it right there. Makes total sense, right? So,
And and the pilots are incentivized to fly higher.
yeah, let's talk about that a little bit, okay? Because we've got a few things here that are I know buzzing around in people's minds. Is for one thing that impressed me was the idea that there is no like button pusher in the plane that and then the trails start, right? Which is what a lot of people claim, especially when they're coming on and coming off. It's like there's someone there switching and having fun with doing SOS signals or
Yeah.
whatever. I don't know
Yeah.
what. There's that idea. The other idea that is that comes up is, well, does every plane have the potential to create these clouds, and essential cirrus clouds, as you mentioned? And why? Is that because of the fuel? And I guess the other aspect that comes into it is, I remember in the 80s and 90s, the skies weren't as like just screwed up as they are now. So what
Agreed.
changed since then? Since like about 97, I would say 96, 97, I started seeing those lingering, and just like the cloud, the sky just lost its beautiful blueness, right? And I
Yeah.
was one of these early on that said it was a conspiracy, right? That there's this chemtrail program, but obviously we now know. So let's talk a little bit about some of those things. Fuel consistency. When did it start? Why did it start? And does every plane have the potential?
Okay. We can go through all that. I need to land my plane on this whole, residence time thing.
Yes, yes,
The
please.
point,
Let's
the
bring
the
that
the, the
residence thing
point,
down.
the point I was trying to make is that, we saw the stratosphere was as low as 25,000 feet.
Right,
That's
exactly.
not going to make a cloud. However, what do geoengineering scientists want to do? It's called solar radiation management, also known as stratospheric aerosol injection. If a plane is flying in the stratosphere, it is injecting all of its aerosols into the stratosphere. Stratospheric aerosol injection. Whether intentional or not, whether it's part of a secret government program or not, the exhaust particulates are landing in the stratosphere. Now, it's the lower stratosphere. Geoengineers would prefer to put it up at 70,000, 60,000 feet minimum, because the higher you get it in the stratosphere, the longer it will persist. So where I said in the troposphere, the aerosols will last from 2 days to 4 weeks at the
Right.
at the very most. In the stratosphere, those same exhaust particulates will last from 2 months to 4 years.
That's kind of diabolical, Jim.
That is why we're seeing a buildup of aerosols, which is whitening the sky. That is what geoengineering actually is.
Is it like reflection off the metal
That's
nanoparticles?
exactly what it is. It's a combination of that plus the water vapor, which is generated. Now, there's much less water vapor generated by planes than there already is in the upper troposphere. But when you're talking about the stratosphere, it's very important to recognize that yes, they are also injecting water vapor, but the reflectivity, or what they call albedo, of the metal nanoparticles that are being lofted, some of these actually go up. The Indian Space Organization actually found black carbon particles from jet fuel at 18 kilometers into the stratosphere. No commercial plane is flying that high. So the question remains, how are these chemicals getting to 18 kilometers? Well, the answer is pretty simple. David Keith, prominent geoengineer, wrote a paper called uh, Photophoretic Levitation of Engineered Nanoparticles. And in it, he specifically said, we want to create a nanoparticle that can be photophoretically levitated, meaning sunlight heats them and causes them to rise up. That's what's happening with every single plane that is flying in the stratosphere. So some of that black carbon, which is covered in graphene, black, if you have a car and you have it in the sun, black paint traps heat. White tends to reflect all heat, all light bands. So having black carbon coming out of planes in the stratosphere, it's actually going up, which is increasing its residence time. This is why one of the most common questions I also get is, why does the sun appear to be more white today
Right.
as
Yes.
opposed to being yellow and orange like when I was in high school? I
Right.
graduated high school in 1995. I remember blue skies. I'm not an idiot. I'm not a shill. I remember exactly the same thing. We're not having a Mandela effect. Um, so I have to like logically go, how did we get here? And in doing, a lot of research on this, I noticed one commonality that really stuck out like a sore thumb. And that was that the first articles on the internet were in 1997 saying chemtrails. The very first article that ever said the word chemtrail on the internet was about JP8 jet fuel. JP8 jet fuel is a NATO jet fuel. So then I started looking into the history of NATO jet fuels, and it hit me like a slap in the face. Just, the NATO had something called the single fuel concept. It started in 1988 and it completed in 1996. They wanted to transition all NATO planes and tanks and jeeps to the same fuel, one fuel for the battlefield, as they called it. Um, so simultaneously from 88 to 96, all NATO countries switched from JP4 to JP8. If you compare them side by side, for an example, calcium, which is a metal, most people don't realize that, but calcium is, if you talk about geoengineering chemicals, it goes like this: sulfur, aluminum, titanium, calcium, diamond dust. Those are the five prominent chemicals that they want to use to reflect sunlight. So, of course, the first thing I do is I look for those chemicals. What about aluminum? Around 2,200 parts per billion in JP4, around 5 to 6,000 parts per billion in JP8. Calcium, 5,000 parts per billion in JP4, 32,000 parts per billion in JP8. That's 32 parts per million. That's an insane increase in impurities in the kerosene-based fuel that's being used in NATO planes. So very quickly, in the span of less than 10 years, from 1988 to 1996, every NATO country was switching to a dirtier jet fuel. And that laid the groundwork for the poisoning of the sky that we see today. So originally, the very first person who talked about it was a guy who called into Art Bell's Coast to Coast AM. And he was saying that the military is using some kind of new fuel, okay? New fuel that has ethylene dibromide in it. That's where the chemtrail conspiracy starts. It's that old game. I don't know if you've ever played it, where somebody tells you something and then you have to whisper it into your friend's
Oh
ear,
yeah.
and then they whisper it in the next friend's
Yeah.
ear, and then finally, after you get to the end, the person at the end of the road says, "All right, now tell me what was said," and the story is completely freaking different.
Yes.
So, knowing that this is a thing, and then going and back and doing the tale of the tape, how did we get here? You realize very quickly that at the beginning we were much closer to the truth. The ethylene dibromide was absolutely hogwash, but regardless, they were focused on this new NATO phenomena, NATO related phenomena. Um, and then there's a lot of other very weird things that happened during that time too. Um, Lowell Wood, Roderick Hyde, and Edward Teller. Lowell Wood is known as Dr. Evil, even by his best friends. And Edward Teller invented the hydrogen bomb. All three of them are from Lawrence Livermore National Lab. And in 1997, they wrote the first paper on mimicking Mount Pinatubo as a, man-made volcanoes, the idea of blocking out the sun by putting chemicals in the stratosphere. That was published in 1997. So there's another coincidence. 1997 also was the patent for stratospheric Welsbach seeding, the idea of putting the chemicals in the stratosphere. So there's a lot of coincidences there. In addition, they came up with something called a plus 100 additive. It's called a HITS additive, a high thermal stability additive. So military planes require certain additives in their jet fuel. And when looking at this HITS additive, it basically allows you to heat the jet fuel tank up another 100 degrees. So the jet fuel in the plane is actually used the same way as the water and or antifreeze in your radiator in your car. It is a heat sink. So in order to keep the fuel lines from freezing, they will put stuff in there that actually keeps it's just like
Oh, right.
antifreeze. Okay.
I used to live in Canada. I had these additives you would drop into your gas tank because it would go to -30 sometimes. And if you didn't have that in your gas tank, the lines would freeze.
Right. So why would it be any different when you're
Right.
flying at a
Especially
very
up
high
there, it's
altitude when
really
it's
cold.
really cold, like
Yeah.
really, really cold? So this HIT additive, which they call JP8 plus 100,
Hmm.
meaning we can heat the jet fuel another 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It's called a thermal stability additive because in order to heat it to another 100 degrees, if it wasn't thermally stable, it would catch on fire and explode. I looked into the material safety data sheets for this. It's actually three separate additives together that make this cocktail for the HITS additive. And I kept seeing the same thing: trade secret ingredient. But all three of the different additives said sulfur, stratospheric sulfur injection. That is geoengineering. That is the number one chemical that they want to put. Why? Because volcanoes do it naturally.
Okay,
So
so let me hold on. Let me just jump in here for a second. Okay, so you're talking about additive chemicals in fuel that point toward active geoengineering. Processes. That means that the geoengineering actually has been going on quietly while everyone's kind of like screaming chemtrails and there's all these pilots pushing buttons. It's actually much more nefarious in a way that it's actually been slid into the ecosystem of the fuel supply of a global transport operation. I mean, because obviously you're going to say next it went from military to commercial, right? Isn't that it must have had that transition at
clearly, clearly, so the simplest answer is usually the right answer. Um, and when you think about it, which is easier, to modify every plane on the planet to have secret pumps and pipes and compartments to hold these chemtrail chemicals, or to just add the chemicals to the jet fuel? It seems much simpler when you do that. So then I started to look into that specifically. And what did I find? Peer reviewed document after peer reviewed document, Freedom of Information Act requests from the military, all the documents pointing the same direction. Hey, we would like to add a lot of sulfur to the jet fuel. It's the same thing in the shipping industry. In the shipping industry, they had something called bunker fuel. Bunker fuel is heavy fuel oil. It is bottom of the barrel crude oil that has been barely refined whatsoever. It has the highest amount of impurities and the highest sulfur content. So when we're talking about truckers, who are driving tractor trailers, 18 wheelers, I don't know what you call them, in Bavaria, but
LKW.
okay, fair enough. I won't even try that. My southern lips are incapable of that. But the truckers, they've had rigorous, sulfur standards put on them recently. So they dropped it. I don't know from what percent, but it was like somewhere around like 2 to 3% down to 0.5% sulfur. Why? Sulfur kills people.
Yeah.
Bottom line. Bottom line. But in the shipping industry, they were running on this high sulfur fuel, which would create marine stratocumulus clouds. These are called ship tracks. Well, it turns out in 2020, the International Maritime Organization banned bunker fuel. And suddenly, all of the science journals are having a collective freak out because that means, oh no, we're going to stop a massive, as they put it, accidental experiment into cooling the planet because they want that sulfur there. They want the sulfur and the
Okay,
clouds
so
of the
they
planet.
knew. So they knew.
Yeah, well, but they call it accidental. Okay.
Accidental, of course.
So Chuck Long, he's part of he's passed away. I didn't get to interview him. I'm very sad about that. But Chuck Long, Charles Long from NOAA's Earth Systems Research Lab, he put out a paper that says um, clear sky daylight whitening. Are we already conducting geoengineering? And his theory was that planes are creating a subvisual ice haze, which is whitening the sky and geoengineering the planet. And it was the exact same thing. His exact terminology was they're creating a subvisual ice haze, which we do not classify as a cloud, which are clearly making the sky whiter and affecting the temperature of the planet. So when he put that published that, the Smithsonian Magazine said airplane airplanes are accidentally geoengineering the planet with contrails and exhaust. So once again, there's that accidental word. Um, and I don't like the word accidental. I like to find intent. So in trying to make conspiracy meet reality, I want to find intent. And I found it. In 2010, Ulrich Schumann from Germany's DLR, which is like Germany's NASA, for the equivalent, they're, an aeronautical society. Ulrich Schumann at the Colloquium on Aviation and Climate Change in 2010 said, we want less warming, more cooling contrails, predictable for operational planning. Now, that doesn't sound like an accident to me. That sounds like intent. Because when I hear the word more, you're now not just saying this is all just, exhaust turning into clouds. You're saying you want less warming, more cooling contrails. Well, what's the difference? Turns out during 9/11, when, the Twin Towers fell here in America, after that, they grounded all flights for 3 days. And
Yeah.
during that time, the diurnal temperature range widened greatly, which means that at night it got colder because there weren't clouds. And the reason why is because during the day, the clouds created by planes do reflect some sunlight coming in. So that would be the solar radiation management. Light reflects off clouds, goes back into space. However, at night, that same cloud shield, the long range infrared radiation comes up and it hits those clouds and is re-radiated back down. That is a greenhouse. That's how a greenhouse works. So I've long held the position that greenhouse gases really aren't a contributing factor to temperature on the planet. However, creating an artificial greenhouse made out of metal ice clouds, which trap heat at the ground, is the reason why Venus looks the way it does. It has sulfuric acid clouds, which basically trap heat at the ground and will forevermore be a desert wasteland. And that's the direction we're headed. So Ulrich Schumann said that in 2010. I, testified at the EPA in 2015 on this because I felt very strongly about, the research I'd done up to this point. I was vindicated multiple times. I had over 200 scientists, contact me after giving that speech saying, how the hell did you know this? Like, where did you come up with this information? Can you share? I'm like, all of the citations were in the testimony. It's right here on my page. And it turns out that more and more I've been validated along the way. In 2017, I believe it was, I interviewed Dr. Rangus Ayhalthori because he was in charge of the biofuels for contrail control access flights. Germany was in a joint thing with NASA and the FAA called eCliff 2. Um, and in these experiments, they were taking biofuels or what are called sustainable aviation fuels to try to regulate the warming effects of heat trapping contrails. And we all know this like inherently. If you go out on a cloudy night, it typically is warmer.
Yes.
If there are no clouds, heat escapes back to space. It's typically cooler. You don't have
No
to be a
brainer.
scientist to recognize this. You can go out and if you see the stars and everything, it's going to be colder than if the entire sky is covered in clouds. So we know this to be a fact. Svensmark is another great researcher on this who's brought up what he calls the climate cloud conundrum. Love the guy. Judith Curry's also spoke about this. Jasper Kirby validated it at the Cloud Project, Cosmics Leaving Outdoor Droplets. So this is pretty much established science at this point. So I interviewed Dr. Hal Thorey and I say to him, what did Ulrich Schumann mean by less warming, more cooling contrails predictable for operational planning? I already knew the answer. I just want to hear it from him. He says, we want more contrail induced cirrus clouds by day and none during the night. Very specific answer. Again, there's that word more. Starting to get really annoyed by the word more because you guys are trying to modify the temperature of the planet by creating the type of contrail cirrus you want. Now, flash forward, just this past year, I was on Dell Big Trees, the high wire, and I explained this, this whole more problem with Dell. And the minute I was done, a gentleman by the name of George, he joined my chat and he said, Jim, you got to see this. And it turns out that in 2023, the year before, the Royal Aeronautical Society had a Greener by Design's contrail avoidance group. And at it, they described avoiding ice supersaturated regions so that they don't create contrail cirrus, which will trap heat during the night. But half of the group of scientists said, what if we intentionally fly into ice supersaturated regions during the day if they're not going to persist into nighttime? And then they immediately admitted that that would be intentional geoengineering. So this is a more complicated, more nuanced answer to the question, because when you look at it, now we're going all the way back to the start with 2010 with Ulrich Schumann. He said predictable for operational planning. He created something called the COSIP, Contrail Cirrus Prediction Tool. Today, you can go to contrails.org, which is contrail plural, contrails.org, and you'll see that Bill Gates has a company called Breakthrough Energy, which is trying to push the aviation industry into doing contrail avoidance to stop making warming contrails. They literally have a map that shows you yesterday. It's not real time yet. But the map, when I went to GitHub and I looked at how they were deriving the data, and I went through all the lines of code. I'm a programmer as well. I looked through all the lines of code, and there's one in there that says contrails.py. It's a Python script. And what do I see at the very top? Credit Ulrich Schumann Contrail Cirrus Prediction Tool. So literally today, Bill Gates and his company Breakthrough Energy have a contrails.org website talking about how they want to make cooling contrails, not warming contrails. They want to predict them, tell pilots in real time to avoid making contrails that will turn into cirrus clouds that last during the night. And that's not an accident. That's not accidental geoengineering. Now, of course, their counter argument would be we're trying to mitigate the global warming
Of
from
course.
clouds being created by planes. But you're also stating that you don't mind making them during the day if they're going to be cooling contrails by definition, you're geoengineering. You guys are geoengineering. So then I go and I look into breakthrough energy and I look at who works for breakthrough energy. Not surprised at all when I see their chief scientist is Ken Caldera, one of the top geoengineers on the planet. It's David Keith and Ken Caldera, the two most infamous names in geoengineering. They've been OGs since the beginning. That's the long story of, just how they're trying to control contrails to geoengineer the planet. That doesn't take into account um, you know, all the stratospheric pollution, which is whitening the sky. Um, in fact, I just found out about this um, Project Saber, which is basically they're now claiming that NASA is creating a geoengineering warning system where they're flying planes in the stratosphere to try to figure out how many metals are in the stratosphere. Now, I've been complaining about this and laughing at them and going, ha ha, you stupid. You have no data. You haven't collected any data on this whatsoever. Well, now they're starting to collect that data. I'll be very interested to see if they actually publish the reports on that. Um,
So
but
is this are these the metals that people report on the ground then? They say that it's, hail, it's raining
yes,
down this stuff and they can prove that they're, blah, 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 because it's on the ground. Yeah.
yeah.
It
What go?
precipitates just like rain. It precipitates out at a
Yeah,
certain point. And
it's got to come down. So, I mean, the thing is, just to put this into perspective, in 2004, there was about 19 million flights per year. 2004. So now we're not back to, when I was in high school, it was much lower. It was closer to, I want to say about probably 10, maybe 12 million flights per year. 2004, 19 million flights per year. 2019, 40 million flights per year. Now, most people don't want to hear this crap, but I'm going to be real with you because I like to keep it real. The the conspiracy and the infatuation with the lines in the sky that we're seeing are a combination of many different factors. It's not just one thing. It's not just NATO. It's not just fuel additives. It's not just how many flights per year it is. It's also the fact that we did not even have social media when we were in high school. Had we had social media like we had today, then in the early 90s, we might have recognized that more people around the world were seeing this. We also didn't have cell phones in our pockets with cameras to upload this stuff.
such
So,
an important point. Such an
so
important.
the social impact of having the ability to record it anytime, anywhere, the ability to upload it anytime, anywhere, that exponentially changed from 2000 on. It wasn't until 2007 that we even had YouTube. Bro, think
Right.
about, I mean, when you think about that aspect of it, that social media like Facebook and YouTube, these things were just gaining popularity after the year 2000. So you can't tell me that, these things didn't exist before then, because if you go to weather-modification-history.com, I have a newspaper vault that goes back to the 1800s. And some of the earliest recognized, problems with what they called vapor trails at the time, the first article I have is like 1948. The next biggest one was in 1958. The city of Palm Springs gripes because planes are
I saw
blocking
that.
out, yeah, blocking out the sun. And then the very next, that was December
That where
58.
they basically told the city, well, if you don't like it, move the city or something like that.
Yeah, December 1958, they complained about it. It was in a bunch of different newspapers. And then January 1959, they met with the Air Force and they told them, you're at the intersection of all West Coast traffic. So either move the city or live with the trails. That is a shocker. I mean, most people wouldn't even consider that.
Right, and on top of it, you have these things are nanoparticles, and there's even you can't like you need specialized equipment to even be able to pick up nanoparticulates and measure them in any kind of a meaningful way, right?
It's very expensive equipment. So
So this
A
stuff
lot
may
of
have
people,
been in the environment since the 50s, is what you're saying, really, already
well,
measured.
you have to consider the number of flights and how expensive it was at the time in the 50s. Um, but by 1970, in 1970, New Jersey and Illinois, the states, sued the airline industry for blocking out the sun. You cannot make this up. This is on case law. This was in newspapers. Um, and this prompted John Volpe, the Secretary of Transportation, who the building is now named after. Um, he basically tried to mediate, out of court a decision between the states and the airline industry to clean up their act. So the airlines were like, okay, we promise we'll stop what you're calling smoke pollution of the sky, which
Okay.
I love these terms, terminology, semantics. It's a thing for me. I have a fascination with it because that we can't think a thought without a word to associate it with it. I can only imagine what it's like for people who are multilingual, like especially when you get into like four, five, seven languages, like what's going on internally in your brain. Um, but we have to have words to associate with thoughts, and they're constantly changing the terminology. A great example, geoengineering became climate engineering, became climate intervention, became solar geoengineering, and solar radiation management became solar radiation modification. And I just heard, oh God, Pete Irvine just gave it a new one. Solar reflecting, oh God, what do you call it? Solar reflecting something materials, something like that. So like it's still SRM. All of these are SRMs, but they're coming
Oh
up with
yeah, isn't
different.
isn't that acronym some kind of almost like it turns into kind of a cuss word or something like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, like they play with the terminology constantly because that way they can hide their research because how do we
Okay.
search the internet? We
Right.
search it with words. So
Right.
if you're just looking up chemtrails, you're going to get nothing but a bunch of people who don't really know what they're talking about, spouting a lot of BS on the internet. But if you understand terms like aviation induced cloudiness, AIC, contrail induced cirrus, suddenly there's a whole new world of information where scientists are admitting, yeah, we've been studying this for decades. We still don't fully understand everything about cloud aerosol interaction and its effects on climate. Um, we don't talk about acid rain anymore, although acid rain was a big thing because guess what? If you put more sulfur in jet fuel, you get water plus sulfur equal
Sulfuric acid.
sulfuric acid. I mean, this is basic, basic
Right.
science. Um, but we don't talk about that anymore. We talk about ocean acidification. And ocean acidification is caused by CO2, not sulfuric acid raining down all over the place. We all know that. So what are you talking about? So these are the kinds of like rabbit holes you get into, even when trying to like make sense of it all. And it's very, and I'm a pretty smart person. I've got a photographic memory, and that's why I write a lot of this down, and I put it in different formats like timelines, maps, articles, videos, infographics. People learn in different ways. So like I like to try to give people different options. I've even done five separate PowerPoint presentations that you can just download and share with other people. Um, but even, about the time I finish a PowerPoint presentation, 2 years goes by, and now I need to go back and edit a lot of the stuff that's in it because guess what? I've learned so much more. Um,
Right.
and
So
that's
what you're
good.
looking at here is that it's, to go after trying to solve this as a problem, we're barking up the wrong tree when we're going after the idea that there's a nefarious group of people that are pulling switches on planes that are specially equipped. Instead, we should be looking at the real causes of this phenomenon going on in our sky and using the data that's really seriously like you can there's just it's black on white. There's no way you can refute it because it's scientific evidence, it's reports, it's their own logged records and data that are stored that prove
Yeah.
what is going on. That would be the only way to kind of get past that problem, right?
Yeah. And then, on the flip side, you literally have the U.S. military, two Freedom of Information Act requests, 1994, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, China Lake, California, the China Naval Weapons Station, which was involved in Operation Popeye, which was weather warfare over Vietnam in the 1960s, 70s. Um, when you read their FOIAs, they all say the same thing: weather modification using carbon black. Now, jet exhaust is black carbon, soot. Carbon black is manufactured. So there is this schism between, well, it's all Jim saying it's all pollution. No, I'm not saying that. Jim's saying that geoengineering isn't happening. I'm saying not only is it happening from jet exhaust, but David Keith and all of the geoengineers who ever talked about geoengineering said the same thing. I can do it with as few as 12 planes. The entire globe. We can geoengineer the entire globe with 12 planes. So the question I would ask you, in the audience that are watching this, do your own gut check, do your own research, go read what they actually talk about deployment methods for stratospheric aerosol injection. And what you will see is, even as recently as last year, David Keith came up with what he called suboptimal geoengineering. So it's like a smaller version. He said that he could do it with 12 to 14 Gulfstream private jets, the entire globe. So
Wow.
when you think about it that way, you're going, so am I looking for a needle in a haystack to find the geoengineering planes,
The
which could
12
be,
out of the 30 million or 40
yeah,
million
when
per
you got
year, right?
40 million flights per year, and they're saying we need 24 planes, operating sometimes all 24, let's say 24 planes. Let's go outrageous with it. Let's say 200 planes. If they had 200 planes flying, once a day, then we're still talking 120 to 150,000 flights per day. 200 of those could be geoengineering planes. So what we're trying to do, especially in my Telegram chat, two of the admins of my Telegram chat, Stella Q, at Stella Q Australia on YouTube, you guys can find their podcast they're doing. It's called Weather or Not. I love the title. So is it weather or is it not? Is it intentional or is it just not? It's just normal weather.
Wow.
Great title, Whether or Not, at Stella Q, Australia. Stella's one of my admins, and Jeff, the meteorologist, joins her. And they're teaching you how to read the sky, how to read this radiosonde data. And the reason why is because you should be able to determine, is this a contrail or not? Because if you see a plane and it's up there spraying a bunch of chemicals, more than likely, honestly, if we're being real honest, if it's geoengineering, it's not going to leave a cloud. They're going to be doing it in the stratosphere. So whatever chemical that's spraying out will be invisible, and they're just turning the sky white. So you're not going to see it. That's the honest, terrible truth about all this, is
Yeah.
that people can't focus on the geoengineering for the clouds. You can't see the forest for the trees. Everybody's so focused on the clouds that our planes are making that they don't realize that if there was a geoengineering program going on, and I say that if, I strongly believe there already is, that
It's happening at another level.
it would most likely be national security. There'd be
Right.
some, security clearance associated with it because, they don't want to, piss off other countries. There are international treaties that, would be broken if you did that. First and foremost would be the Environmental Modification Convention, the prohibition on hostile environmental modification techniques, 1978, which was the weather warfare ban, signed by the United Nations and parties, as a result of weather warfare in Vietnam and in Cuba. The CIA was involved in that.
Right.
But in both
Yeah.
cases, the CIA was involved in weather warfare in Vietnam and against Castro's Cuba. Well, it turns out the CIA then funded the National Science Foundation studies on climate intervention, both carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification. John Brennan, former head of CIA, standing in front of the Council on Foreign Relations. I really like this idea of stratospheric aerosol injection. I call them the Climate Intelligence Agency. Why? Because every single time there's ever been weather warfare that has been documented, it was the CIA who was behind it. So, riddle me this. Does the CIA have its own airline? Yes, it does. And if the CIA were involved in geoengineering, would you know? No, you would not.
Right.
And is there any way you could prove they were geoengineering? No, you can't. So this goes back to the whole idea where I started on this thing that was back in the 50s through the 1970s, even into the 80s, the Manhattan Rochester Coalition, the U.S. Army Chemical Corps was spraying zinc cadmium sulfide from C-117s, what they call a flying boxcar. It's Operation Large Area Coverage, where they literally flew from like California to the East Coast, just spraying radioactive zinc cadmium sulfide all over America. That they were spraying these in, downtown St. Louis on poor neighborhoods and, black kids in elementary school. And then
Wonderful.
following them till they died and exhuming, their body and grinding up their thyroids to figure out how much radioactive zinc cadmium sulfide they ingested. Their justification for spraying the entire United States with chemtrails and doing human experimentation without public notification was they were trying to simulate what nuclear fallout would be.
Oh, wonderful.
So here's the moral of the story and my operating premise. If the United States Army Chemical Corps was doing chemtrails and spraying everybody with zinc cadmium sulfide for 3 decades, and it took them until 2008 to admit they did it, are you willing to sit around and rest on your laurels and wait for them to admit that they're doing a geoengineering program? I am not. I don't want to be, this number goes up every time I say, I don't want to be 132 years old, on my deathbed and looking at ZNN on the television going, back in the 2000s, the Climate Intelligence Agency was spraying chemicals into the atmosphere, which actually saved us from global warming. And I'll be that guy going, I knew I was right. I knew they were doing it. I knew it. What will it matter then?
Yeah.
So that's where you gotta put your head around this thing and try to be pragmatic. Um, are there secret government programs? Of course there are. They're always going to be. They will never ever tell the truth about what they're doing. That's what black budgets are for. Who has a history of doing this over and over again? The CIA. Is climate change considered a national security threat? Yes. Are they currently deploying a geoengineering monitoring network because they are threatened that other countries may be doing geoengineering? Right now, yes. So when you look at all of the different aspects of this, you have to look at it from so many different perspectives. There is a lot of pollution from 40 million flights per day, which are creating clouds, and people are pissed off about clouds. Understandably so. But at the same time, they don't understand how those clouds are even formed. So that's where, my role is to try to inject some sanity while everybody else is doing stratospheric aerosol injection. I want to inject some clarity into this very multifaceted thing going on. And you mentioned the breaks in the clouds. Well, what are they doing, Jim? Are they just turning their engines on and off? Well, you don't understand turbulence very much. You don't understand gravity waves and lee waves and how that affects things. In fact, gliders gliders actually look for these breaks in the clouds because when the gravity wave happens, typically if you have a mountain here, the wind coming up over the mountain, then it starts to undulate. These are called lee waves.
Is that what
What that
creates that like multi like
That's why
rib
you see the
patterns?
rib bone
Ribbed
patterns.
patterns. Yeah, it's not harp then.
No, it's not harp. Harp can't do that. And in fact, it doesn't
Well,
even make
let me just
sense.
jump in there because that means have you seen those clouds that look like giant rolls?
Yeah,
And when I was an editor for Red Bull Media House, and we used to make films on sport porn, if you want to go into that.
yeah,
And one of the shows that I did was this guy that actually was a hang glider, and he was in Australia, and he would in one particular region of that country there would be these rolling clouds, and he would look for that cloud, and he could glide at the crest of that rolling cloud for like 40, 50 miles, like uninterrupted.
like riding a wave in
Like
the
riding a
ocean.
wave. That would be like another extreme example of what you're just describing right there. And people used to
Because
think that's a chemtrail, right? It's like, no, those are natural formations. They happen in certain places of the world when the atmospheric conditions are just right.
they're rare, don't get me wrong. They're
Yeah.
rare. But they're not so rare when you're talking about like, you know, islands in the middle of the ocean. You can see these almost every single day on satellites where you've got ground level wind running up over a mountain and then leaving these ripple eddies off of a mountain. Those are called lee waves. By the way, my name is Jim Lee. Coincidence. Um, lee waves, it's the same thing as if you drop a rock in a still pond. There will be ripples and they will go out and then they will slowly dissipate as they get to the edge. The same thing with a stream. If you have a stream on the ground, let's say it's only this wide, and you take a rock this big and you put it right in the center, what you're going to see is those same waves. It's the same idea. So the sky is a river. Air is a fluid. Whether you know this or not, now you know, and you can go verify it yourself. Don't trust me. I'm just some dude on the internet. Go do your research, as they say. Um, but that's one of the reasons why when you have clouds, which are linear, cirrus clouds being laid out by planes, that you get these breaks because you have these undulations. Other times it's just simply turbulence. Other times it's actually fuel performance issues. So you have things like now that they're using all these biofuels, you can actually have something called flame contamination. It's fatty acid methyl ester, where they've actually had flame outs on planes where their engine literally flamed out, and kicking, sputtering, all of that, poor maintenance, um, too much additives, not enough additives. There are so many different things that could be causing this. In fact, they tried to debunk all this, and Mick West and Ken Caldera, mentioned him already. Ken Caldera, Mick West is um, probably the most famous chemtrail debunker in the world. He's been on National Geographic, and anytime they need somebody for a special to talk about contrails, they pull him in. He seems to have retired now. He's moved on to UAPs and UFOs. I can't even get him to talk about contrails anymore. But regardless, we debated one time. It was pretty funny. If anyone wants to see it, it's on my YouTube. Bad Climate Viewer on YouTube. It's a pretty funny interview. But we argued for over 10 years. They did something called the SLAP paper, Secret Large Scale Aerial Program, SLAP. It's literally titled, I'm going to slap you guys in the face. And it's interesting because they ask 100 scientists, have you ever seen elevated, unusually abnormal amounts of aluminum or barium in a soil sample? One guy said, yeah, out of 100. And, there's this series of questions. The question that really stands out for me, though, why are there stops and starts to contrail Cirrus. Nobody agreed on this one. And I thought that that was just the red herring for a long time. But it turns out that there are so many different reasons why that can occur. A lot of them said the obvious ones: up drafts, down drafts. Mentioned possibility with changes in thrust. Um, but after talking to multiple pilots about this, a lot of it also is changes in altitude, because from a ground perspective, it's very hard to tell whether plane's flying up or down, it's gaining altitude or lowering. So as a plane is gaining altitude, it might go through a water layer here and then none, and then a water layer here. So as it's gaining altitude, it's actually flying through different layers of moisture and leaving clouds as it's going through, and then no clouds here. Um, at the end of the
Wow.
day, it's almost like the plane itself is a tracer for the invisible.
Yeah,
It's very similar to what they do in space weather modification with HARP and sounding rockets. Sounding rockets leave chemical trails in the upper atmosphere to make things like magnetic field lines visible, to make upper atmospheric winds visible. They use barium, strontium, and trimethyl aluminum almost exclusively. There are other things that they've used. Hell, they've used radioactive cesium-137 and sulfur hexafluoride, even though
wonderful.
it's banned because sulfur hexafluoride kills the ozone layer. Um, but these sounding rockets, I like to call them chemtrails from space. They're the same thing. They make the invisible visible. So if you go to get an MRI, at a hospital, they might put a barium tracer in your body.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's the exact same thing with space weather modification. Why would it be any different with
They
jet
do it with
exhaust?
underground rivers. I did a show on some cave divers that went 12 kilometers into the earth in Mexico, deep, deep underground, like rivers, lakes, caves.
Yeah,
And they would leave and they would drop like dye into the water, and they would know if that water emerged on the other side of that mountain ridge
that
somewhere
makes perfect
else.
sense.
It makes
It-
perfect sense because then you can trace the water flow of a particular, and they do these kinds of experiments. Why would it be any different with the geeks that are experimenting with magnetosphere conditions, that are studying that magnetosphere? As we know, the magnetosphere is diminishing radically.
yeah,
That's a
we're
whole
headed
other aspect that comes
headed
into
towards
it.
that grand solar minimum. So,
Right.
yeah, they're expecting a 70% reduction in the Earth's magnetic field by 2035.
Yeah.
And it's supposed to persist until 2054, I believe. So, during this grand solar minimum, you can expect much more galactic cosmic rays
Yeah.
penetrating deeper into the atmosphere, meaning more clouds. So, if you think it's cloudy now, just wait and see, because as the force fields of our planet begin to weaken, we will have increased galactic cosmic ray penetration, which will increase the number of clouds. Understanding these large systems and how chaotic they are and how little we know about them, for anybody to sit here and say, I know with 100% certainty that this is what the weather is going to be like, then I dare you to pull out your phone, look at the 7-day forecast, take a screenshot of it, and then 7 days from now, take another screenshot of it and see how close they were 7 days from now. Do it for a month straight, and you will literally start to laugh your ass off at how uh, poor we understand the weather systems to just be able to predict what it's going to be 7 days from now. No weatherman on the planet can tell you what the cloud cover is going to be 3 days from now, let alone 7 days from now, because you just can't tell. Why? We don't have enough sensors. We don't have enough data. We don't have computers fast enough, smart enough, with enough information in them to predict this stuff, which goes back to my fundamental theme on all of this. We should not be screwing with very large, chaotic systems which we do not understand. because the ramifications could be a lot of dead people. That's why I'm against cloud seeding. That's why I'm against geoengineering. That's why I'm against space weather modification. Do not screw with the weather because, you know, we have no way to hold you accountable. You're not transparent about when you're doing it. So
Right.
if you're not going to be honest about when you're doing it, then we can't hold you to account when you cause freaky floods, hellish hail, or, any of the other crazy things that are going to happen, because all the predictions for what geoengineering will do to the planet, they tend to say the same things, that the southern hemisphere will get drier, the northern hemisphere will get wetter, means we're going to get biblical flooding in the northern hemisphere, and there's going to be a lot of dead brown people in the southern hemisphere. And the only thing holding all of this up right now from being just a out in the public global geoengineering deployment program, which everybody knows who's doing it, when they're doing it, why, is something called geoengineering governance. And this has been argued at the last two Nations Environmental Assembly, the UNEA 6 and 5. They tried to pass some form of geoengineering governance structure. And it's basically an international agreement that we need to do geoengineering because global warming's so bad. But if we don't get an agreement, then aggrieved countries may want to either sue other countries or go to war with other countries because they did geoengineering and harmed their local climate. And that is a very real scenario. So the fact that we're in this really gray area right now where other countries could be geoengineering and we cannot prove it,
Right.
and that would affect all of the weather in the world, and we cannot prove who did it. That is why I proposed a couple of years, well, maybe 8 years ago. I came up with something. I called it the clarity clause. It was because a clause is a add-on to a legislation. I've since renamed it the Environmental Modification Accountability Act, because it's one thing to ban weather warfare in 1978. It's another thing to catch somebody doing it.
Right.
So my solution for starters is, and even though I hate the United Nations, I think they're worthless. They should be defunded and just destroyed. Um, be very clear about how I feel about the United Nations, but you work with what you got, right?
Right. Right.
So if nothing else, getting the NMOD treaty, the weather warfare ban of 1978, updated to include transparency and verification. You got to submit to an international registry of atmospheric experimentation at least 48 hours before you do any kind of experimentation in the sky, whether it's cloud seeding, shooting lasers to steer lightning bolts, shooting lasers to make it rain, cloud ionizers, whether they're on the ground or on drones, any of these technologies. We need to know when you did it, where you did it, and down to the minute. In the United States, we have something called the Weather Modification Reporting Act of 1972. It simply requires you fill out a sheet of paper and say, hey, we're going to do weather modification in the Rocky Mountains with ground-based cloud seeding generators. We're going to do it October through March of this year. They don't have to say when during that time. All they
Well,
have to do is say the total number of hours, how much chemicals they dispersed, and over what general area.
so
That
this kind
is
of a document is what you would need to kind of begin to get a grasp on what is really going on in the world, what is natural and what is artificial, right? I
right.
mean, what do you like? Would you say like, I mean, look, right now we have Turkey is going through a blizzard, right? They had massive flooding in Spain, which is, of course, a natural phenomenon called Dana, which people don't want to believe, but it does happen in Spain on a regular basis. The extremity of it has changed a little bit. and that has to do with various factors. Sometimes it's they've removed infrastructural aspects which may have stopped the flooding from being as bad as it would have.
The dam removals
Right.
plus the Honga Tonga eruption. Most people
Yep.
don't even consider that we're
Yeah.
still being affected by all that water that was blasted into the stratosphere by the Honga Tonga eruption, which is a sub-oceanic volcano which blew a bunch of water into the
Right.
stratosphere. That's changing weather on a worldwide basis.
Right. So you think that a lot of this really craziness right now still has somewhat of a foundation in a natural phenomenon? Or do you think how much of this do you think is actually being affected, or what's your estimate of like weather warfare, secret or not so secret or covert or whatever, that's actually affecting the weather patterns that are natural to become extreme? Or do you think we're just really
So
actually experiencing a crazy extreme period?
I think both can be true. So there is no such thing as weather control. There is only weather modification. We do not have control over anything. Control is an illusion. Um,
You mean they didn't steer Helene toward those lithium fields
no,
and no, okay.
no, that's hocus pocus mumbo jumbo from fear porn pushing clickbait title, rich dudes who, you know, profit off the pain of others. Um, I mean, these soul vampires to be profiting off of people who literally just lost everything. I live in South Carolina. I lived through Hurricane Hugo. I lived in a place that, wasn't put back together for over a year. Um, I literally was wanting to jump through my screen and strangle some of these fools. Meanwhile, in our Telegram chat, we are literally tracking every flight that even goes near that. We're tracking every ship that goes near those storms. We're tracking every single atmospheric condition from start to finish. And I'm going, Jeff, bro, I'm seeing a high pressure ridge off the, east coast of North Carolina, low pressure on the western side of the Appalachian Mountains. Storms are going to follow the path of least resistance. The only question remains is, can you create artificial high pressure and low pressure regions? Because if you can, then you could possibly alter the path of a storm. Um, the amount of power in a hurricane is astronomical. No NEXRAD, no HARP, no radio frequency, anything can affect the weather. The amount of power required is just too great. Chemically, there have been hundreds of different proposals for modifying storms, especially like hurricanes. They've tried it in the past, Project Cirrus, Project Storm Fury, NOAA's Department of Homeland Security, um, Hurricane Modification Workshop 2008 after Hurricane Katrina. All of them have said the same thing. We would like to try these types of things like carbon black dust, like the Salter sink, which is like ocean pipes. They're ocean upwelling pipes. They take cold water from the bottom of the ocean, they pump them up to the surface to try to weaken hurricanes. Um, they come up with proposals, but are they doing them? We don't know. It would it be effective even if we did know they were doing it and they did it? Probably not, because we don't understand. Nobody, and I mean this, everybody will make the argument, oh, but Jim, the military, they're always like 30 years ahead of everything.
Right.
You don't know what they know. Bullshit on this one. All right. Like I'm calling 100% bullshit on the military knows way more about how to control the weather than anybody else, because at the end of the day, they're using the same sorry ass technology that everybody else has been. And this is straight from their own FOIAs and everything. There is no magic silver bullet for controlling weather. In fact, cloud seeding was invented in 1946, and I have 14 separate papers that say that to this day, the most recent being published this year, there is no efficacy in cloud seeding, meaning there's no way to have repeatable results that are expected. There is no science to cloud seeding. They generally have a theory about how cloud seeding with silver iodide or sodium chloride affects cloud condensation nuclei, affects heat transfer and water condensation to make maybe a little bit more rain. But there are other papers out there that say actually it can create drought because if you have too many seeds and not enough water vapor, that's called overseeding. That's what the Russians did during Chernobyl to keep the rain, the radioactive rain from reaching Moscow. They went over Belarus and they overseeded the sky, which caused all of the fallout to land on Belarus. That's why you see in Ukraine, you see a big radioactive bubble around the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And then you see another big bubble in Belarus. And right above that is Moscow. And there's no radioactivity there because they overseeded in the
They induce
Belarus
the
region.
precipitation. So that's a limited form of participating with the natural elements and enhancing them or diminishing them to a degree that is possible by humanity.
Yeah, so
That's a far different thing than a full spectrum. I mean, that's one thing that we started with today is like this idea that there's this full spectrum power control by a group of nefarious black ops agencies over the weather to keep us completely in chaos, right? This is a very, very dangerous thought to have because what you're describing here means that, yeah, they're playing with it and they're trying. But it's like, and I made this analogy, I think, on that show, that shitstorm show, where I said it's like
it was
standing in the.
great, by the way. I enjoyed it and I read all the comments. I watching
Thanks
people
a lot.
lose their
Thanks a
mind.
lot. We have to follow that one up still. And it's like I said, it's like standing with a flashlight in the dark, even a very powerful flashlight, beaming it at the forest, and you're going, wow, like that's light, powerful light, right? And it's even creating maybe some heat near the bulb, right? It's like us, man-made technology affecting the dark, nature. And then somebody switching on, if they could, noon, high sun, no cloud cover in comparison. Would you even still see the beam that is being projected by somebody with
No.
a flashlight? No. We all know that. Take a computer out into a bright sunny day and try to read the screen. It's like we just don't have that kind of full spectrum control. And I think that's a relief it should be a relief for a lot of people. That should be a big takeaway because people are depressed about this stuff. I mean, they're like that whole Greta Thunberg movement, right? It just created
Yeah.
so much depression in people. People were saying, "I'm not going to have kids anymore."
Yeah.
I
I
mean,
mean,
it's
that's
look at that what it
stupid.
releases into the world, this kind of paranoia, right?
Yeah. And at the end of the day, like you're actually empowering these scientists because what if you go along with this narrative, then you're basically giving these people more credit than they're due. Instead of readily mocking them for their inability to, fap with the weather for better terms. I'm not sure if you know what that means, but okay. Anyway, they're, it's like they get in their little conferences and they have this mutual masturbation where they all say, "Oh yes, we're so scientific and we know what geoengineering is and that it would be completely safe and effective." Like, bro, you just tried to sell us on the COVID vaccine with the whole safe and effective. You just tried to sell us on, you know, face diapers will stop virus,
Yeah,
bro. I mean, come on. None of what you said was science. Like none.
yeah.
Redefining vaccines to not mean something that gives you immunity to a thing. It's now a prophylactic. Like the scientific community has like eggs and poo all over its face. But suddenly you talk about weather modification or, weather warfare, and people want to go, oh, yeah, there's these, dark actors who can control everything. Like with a
The
freaking,
patents, right?
they've got a, it's the patents, man.
Yeah,
Um, so they've got a Xbox 360 joystick and they're controlling the hurricane like on a perfect pattern. They're like, all right, hit that county, then hit this county. Come on, dude. You're not being realistic. And when you take that power back away from them and say, look, you guys are literally just creating climate chaos.
Yeah.
And the people who are doing cloud seeding, they are literally snake oil salesmen. If you look at it from that perspective, that they are just making claims to make a buck. When in the case of cloud seeding,
Grant funding.
that's you know it's all we got. It's the only shot. Water is life. Water is blue gold. Water will be to the next century what oil was to the last. When you hear
I used
all
to
these
say that.
quotes, then you realize that people are desperate, and desperate people will pay people if they make them a promise. And these people go out, they try to deliver, and if they don't, if they under deliver, they go, you know what? Pay me more, we'll try again.
Yeah.
And if they overperform, they were like, oh, that was climate change, that was God, that wasn't me. Because if the flood happens, they're not going to take responsibility for it. So that's the big problem I have with all this is if if we actually wanted people to be able to study this scientifically and be able to hold people accountable, then if in the United States we have an app, you cannot make this up, where illegal immigrants, asylum seekers, I don't give a shit what you call them, they can go to an app and for the Department of Homeland Security and say,
Oh yeah, I heard
"Hi,
about this.
my name is Juan Valdez and I'm in Tijuana and I would like to come to North Carolina and could you meet me here?" And they can hit submit. So we have an app for illegal immigrants to come into our country, but we don't, and they're still illegal even after they use this government approved
Right,
app.
right, exactly, exactly. Yeah, I
But
just
we
read that.
don't have an app that, when somebody wants to try to control the weather,
Yeah.
modify it for precipitation enhancement, hail mitigation, snowpack augmentation, the list goes on, that we just require you to fill out a sheet of paper and then say, I'm going to modify the weather from October through March with ground based cloud seeding generators. Fine. Why don't we have an app that says, okay, I am turning it on today at this time? Okay, so during the entire time that you're, permitted to modify the weather that you told the government you were going to, that we collect that data and display it in real time.
Yeah.
Because then other scientists and meteorologists and climatologists, all of the different, atmospheric science people, including the people who make the predictions of the weather, they can go, well, at these locations right now, there are cloud seeding generators operating. A storm is coming in. I watch the storm come in. It gets sprinkled with cloud seeding generators right here. What happens to the storm next? We'll put a bunch of snow on top of the mountain. Cool. All right. The snow happened here. Wait a minute. It got bigger.
Hmm.
And then it created a flood over Boulder, Colorado. And then it went on to the next state and it mixed with another storm front. Now it's loaded with all these cloud seeding agents and it created some very bad flooding over here. At that point, the attorney general of that state
Right.
would be able to say, I'm following it back. You did it. You
Yeah.
break, you buy. It's really that simple. And that's what I'm advocating for is that we have strict transparency laws, strict reporting on every activity, not broad brush, just blanket immunity for what you do. Because if we were able to actually see that, then people could run statistics, gather intelligence, do some real freaking science on
That's
something
it.
that's been around since
Actually, very
1946.
simple, very, very simple idea. It's just the
It
execution of it that seems to be the big problem, right? Nobody
they
wants
don't
this data
they
out there.
don't want the accountability.
Right.
They don't want the transparency. That tells me you're nefarious and greedy AF.
Yeah.
And that's why I have a problem with you people. You're going to lie. You're going to obfuscate. You're going to say, oh, this isn't really necessary. Oh, this is an undue burden on the people who are doing cloud seeding projects. They did a paperwork reduction act thing. And they basically said, oh, well, it's really burdensome for people to have to like write down every time they go and they do it. How about no? How about in a world where you're driving climate fear porn every single day and blaming every storm on CO2 and cow farts, that
Yeah.
we have some honesty. The reason why they fear it the most is because if I get my way with the Environmental Modification Accountability Act, if I get my way with this real-time reporting of weather modification, the worst effect it's going to have is that there will be global awareness of this. The normies will not be able to ignore it anymore. And once you wake up the normies, you're going to get a whole bunch of very conservative Christians that are like, God should control the weather, not man. You're going to get farmers
Yeah.
who are like, so you mean to tell me the farm across, 2 miles from my
Yeah.
house, they're paying to make it rain on their crops, and I'm the one that got hit with hailstones. What the hell? I mean, the lawsuits would fly. And I think that just awareness of the amount and the level of, climate, I'm trying not to curse. I want to say some, um, climate suckery that's going on. If people
Yeah.
realized how many people had their hand in the cookie jar and were screwing with the weather, then I think there would be a massive revolt on a very large public scale, and they would not be able to sell this narrative that CO2 is behind all of the climate chaos that we're seeing. That's
Okay.
firmly where I stand.
Well, I think we've covered an incredible span of information, of deep information, actually relatively deep. I know we could go on for hours. Obviously, I think I sense we're going to have a part two. Um, but for now, I mean, look, there's one more question I wanted to ask you. What about those badges?
Which badges are you talking
You
about?
know, the ones that say, chemtrail team or
Oh God, I have so
and
much fun with
what about
those.
the airplanes with those tanks? And that you see that they're obviously the chemtrail filled tanks, right?
So I
Those,
just covered that last night. I did a video on the ballast tank hoax. It's on my YouTube. It just coincidentally, I wrote about it on my Substack. This is the last article I just wrote. Ballast tanks generally are used for testing planes for their center of gravity there for test flights before a plane goes into operation. I covered like Donald Trump tours chemtrail plane
right. Oh
2017,
yeah, yeah. We've seen
how
those pictures, right?
how all of that, was absolute bullshit. They said that, he was doing it at Andrews Air Force Base. No, he was actually in North Charleston, South Carolina, in my home state at the Boeing plant, in a 787 Dreamliner, looking at a test plane. Um, we have ballast tanks, which are just move water around in a plane real quickly to simulate several different things, but affecting the center of gravity of a plane so that it doesn't fall out of the sky whenever, some 400 or 500 pound fat dude decides he got to run to the toilet really quickly. If something as silly as that, or in the cargo bay, if the cargo comes unstrapped and it
And
all
rolls to
shifts
the front. Yeah.
rapidly, they want to make sure the plane's not going to fall apart. Plus, they pump fuel between the different wings and the different, all that stuff affects center of gravity, can cause a plane to fall out of the sky. In fact, it did in Bagram Air Force Base. There was a C 747 cargo plane, and they had a bunch of military vehicles. And in the back of it, one came unstrapped, and the plane ended up crashing on takeoff and killed everybody on board. So this is a serious matter. Other ones, photos that I see often are like the modular aerial spray system, which is used to spray mosquitoes and stuff like that. That's called adulticide. They're also used to spray herbicides like Agent Orange, but they don't use Agent
Nice.
Orange anymore. They just use different chemicals like Alston. They have all these different names for them. So, can you hear my chickens on the microphone? I think I can hear
Maybe a tad, but it's cool. I like it. Keep going.
my rooster won't shut up. But these images are always misappropriated. They say this is proof of chemtrail pumps and pipes. And in the 20 years I've been doing this, Nobody's ever sent me a photo that I could not find out where it originally came from on the internet. And it had nothing to do with Delta Airlines, United Arab Emirates Airlines, Southwest, even, the dudes flying Amazon packages around. Furthermore, if there was, like people point out like the Tennessee chemtrail ban, they're like, well, Tennessee banned chemtrails. I'm like, really? Okay, let's have some fun with you fools. There will be no chemtrails in Tennessee tonight, but starting tomorrow, the chemtrails will resume because we've got a heads up note from the Illuminati that we will be spraying your skies for the next 3 days straight. Have a nice, dim evening. And at the end of the day, we can predict that with 100%, well, at least 90% certainty, because we can look at the atmospheric conditions. We can see the ice supersaturated regions moving towards Tennessee, and we know damn well planes are going to be in the air. So the minute we see these atmospheric conditions and they move over Tennessee and the planes fly through, we're like, and just so you know, we at the Illuminati chemtrails, we don't just spray them, we bury them. And that's where the pilots really get in on this thing because they have been threatened. I've talked to so many pilots about this. They're just sick and tired of people not understanding how contrails are formed. And I'm sick and tired of the pilots not understanding that those contrails contain poisonous chemicals. And
Right.
I'm upset about that. These people aren't. They think that you're just poisoning them with a switch. So
Right.
what do? They go on eBay and they buy a chemtrail switch. There are so many websites out there.
What?
Sierra Hotel was a website I was on just yesterday. I posted this in my Telegram chat. I was like, Christmas wish list. Here's my address. Anybody want to buy me any one of these things? I want to start collecting them because I want to get like one that says, chemtrail tank and put it on my coffee cup. They sell stickers, they sell like fake buttons that you can put on your dashboards. It's like turn the chemtrail pumps on. You know, all this stuff. There's a growing industry of pilots, for pilots to buy these things to make videos and troll because they think these people are really dumb and
So
they're
it's real
getting
tongue in
threatened.
cheek. So
Yeah, they
satire pure. You're talking about kind of a vaudeville video, and clandestine video action on behalf of some of these pilots because they're just sick and tired of the nonsense and they want to play with it.
Yeah, at this point,
You're gonna piss a
I'm
lot of people off by saying that. You realize that, right? I'm gonna get
I don't care. You guys should be ridiculed. I mean, let's be realistic. Like if I were them, I would troll the shit out of you people. Like if you're like I saw a dude and he literally had somebody sent me this video on Telegram and he had a Cessna plane and on it had a wingtip freaking fuel tank. And I'm like looking at that going, that's a wingtip fuel tank. And it had a sticker on it that said chemtrail tank. And I was like,
Oh my
and
God.
then he goes,
Right. They're
he
really gonna
walks,
call it chemtrail tank
yeah,
too,
and it
right?
says chemtrail tank on and people are dumb enough to believe these videos. And that's what they're pointing out. They're like, I'm a pilot. I spent all this time because I want to learn to fly. I bought my own plane. They may even be a crop duster who, is technically spraying chemtrails all
Yeah,
over the ground.
yeah.
But regardless, they goes around to the cockpit and then he zooms right in, and there's this huge chemtrail on off switch. And a friend of mine, mutual friend, sent me this video on Twitter. And then I sent him a picture back with a link to eBay. And it said 1950s vintage style chemtrail switch. And it was the exact box that was in the video he just watched. And he just sat there and he's like, well, son of a bitch, I got played. And I'm like, yeah, dude. Like, what do you expect them to do?
Yeah.
I mean, they're having fun with it. So for me, like, I deal with a lot of this really heavy stuff. I mean, I research things like directed energy weapons, infrasound cannons, things that literally could just destroy your brain from miles away.
Right.
That's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
So I try to deal with it with laughter. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? Like I listen to music. I like to joke. I like to watch a lot of comedy. Comedy gets my mind off this stuff. So keep it light, keep it fresh. Don't be doom and gloom. Um, Otherwise, I could just go full Alex Jones all day long and just be like,
Raging Jim.
constantly, huh?
Raging Jim with a purple head.
Yeah, I mean, seriously, like these freaking Illuminati, they're all the Illuminati that are out there. They're constantly they hate you, they despise you. You're the carbon they want to sequester. They want to put you under the ground, and they're going to do it with their chemtrail operations, spraying 24/7 on all the NATO bases around the globe because you are the carbon they want to destroy. And I could do that, and I could make a lot of money doing it.
Good one.
But
That was
what?
excellent.
But what good? What good would that
What
be?
good does it do? What good does it do?
I'm
Well,
doing
listen,
this for my daughters. I have two daughters,
yeah.
15 years old, 8 years old, and I don't want them to grow up in a world where these guys are allowed to continue to modify the weather at will with no responsibility whatsoever, let alone geoengineer the planet. I want my great grandchildren to be able to see stars. I want them to have the adequate amount of sunlight, and I don't want men controlling the weather. So that is my goal in life. And whether people like what I have to say about chemtrails and contrails, you know what? I don't care. I hope that you'll look into it. But I'm saying this to be that one person that's like giving a middle finger to everybody else. That's me. I'm going to be that one guy. And you know what? If you don't like it, then clearly you're not ready. But when you're ready, I'm here and my material will be here. And I hope that you'll research it. And then if you find that I've got something wrong, reach out to me. Hell, my cell phone number is on my website, connect.climateviewer.com. It's got my email address, my cell phone number, my home address is on all of my website. I cannot be more transparent. And I encourage people to say, Jim, you're wrong, and here's why. And if you know what, if you prove me wrong, I'm going to be the first to admit it because I see my job as being honest and active with telling people, hey, here's where we got it kind of wrong, or here's where we got it way wrong, and we need to course correct. Here's how we can go about fixing it because I am determined to come up with a solution to this problem as a part of being part of the problem.
Well, Jim, I really appreciate what you do, and I'm really thankful that we've had a good round. Like, oh, we're going on a couple hours now. I hope I didn't take up too much of your time, and I really I see you as the weather vigilante, and I hope everything keeps going in your favor. And where do people get in touch with you? I guess you kind of said it already. Is there anything else you want to add at the end on the way out, or did we cover everything? I mean, I know I could probably keep going, but I think we should give it a break here. It's been a lot of information for people listening, and we'll do a round two at some point in the future. That would be
Yeah,
great.
I've done a couple X spaces, 5 hours each. I did like
Yeah, I
three
believe
of
it.
them where I went 5 hours straight, just answering
Sure.
questions from
Yeah,
people.
well, you get a Q and A
Um,
involved, and that's what'll happen. Yeah.
oh man, once the questions start coming, it's like, all right, I probably should get some honey and lube the throat very well
Yeah.
because it's gonna go out on me. But yeah, I really appreciate you having me on, Frank, and I thoroughly enjoyed watching you in that video. The mental fog that like comes over people when they first hear this information, I
Right.
totally get it. It's
Yeah.
overwhelming.
Right.
It's
We've all
not
been
what you
part of it.
I mean, but has that not happened during your whole? Can you remember when you were a child and you figured out your parents were Santa Claus? I mean, come on. This stuff happens to you throughout your life. It's always going to happen. There are people who are just now figuring out, you know what? The government doesn't have your best interests at heart and on anything,
Yeah.
so like this everybody's at different stages of their awakening. And I even hate the term
Yeah.
awakening because once you think you've actually awakened, that's when you realize that's when you actually have just started
Right.
because you
Exactly.
haven't figured out that you don't know shit.
Right.
I'm at least past that. I thought I was awake, and now I'm getting towards the I don't know shit. And the more I am in the I don't know shit category, the better I feel about it, because I believe the term always a student, sometimes a teacher, never an expert. And
Yeah.
if you stay in that place, then yes, I have things to teach, but I have more things to learn. And I will constantly be a student for the rest of my life, which leaves me open to the possibility that I could be wrong. Um, and if you'd like to prove to me that I'm wrong, you can find me at connect.climateviewer.com. I will be creating a chemtrail only website in the future, but for now, weather-modification-history.com is the world's most comprehensive encyclopedia of weather modification events from 1800 to present. There's an interactive timeline, there's newspapers on there, and now there's 1,181 geoengineering and weather modification patents in a searchable archive database. Um, climateviewer.org, where I have my WebGL 3D globe. It's similar to Google Earth, where you can see things like HARP and all the ionospheric heaters worldwide. By the way, there's only 3 of them. But there's also incoherent scatter radars, ELF, VLF transmitters, laser beams, and Illuminati eyeballs, spy facilities. Oh my. Over 600 maps, including real-time maps at climateviewer.org. And finally, climateviewer.com is my blog. I've stopped publishing articles like breaking news on my blog. And I've started doing that on Substack, which is at climateviewer.substack. But regardless, everything I just told you, I have a YouTube, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, and a bunch of other stuff. Everything you can find at connect the dots, connect.climateviewer.com. That's my link tree. And join us in the Telegram chat. Come in and argue with me. I'll be there. You can go, you know what? I saw you on the Frank Jacobs video, and you know what? You're completely full of shit. Just know that there's going to be a a very large amount of science smart people in the room that you're going to have to convince them too. And good luck with that, because I've got some of the best followers on the planet. I don't need a billion followers for me to feel special. I know that if I had 20 followers and they're as devoted as the 20 that I have in my Telegram chat, I'll take them any day over, quality over quantity. I'll take that every day. Um, so that's where I land. I want to find solutions. I want to find pragmatic people and other people who are going to push the envelope, push me to push other people to wake up and smell the chemtrails.
Well, good for you, Jim. Thanks for joining me, and we'll be in touch. That's all I can say. Definitely. I'll be watching what you're doing, and I'll be joining your Telegram channel, and I advise everybody who's listening to do the same.